All right, well, let's begin. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to SCAG's Toolbox Tuesday. Today's session focuses on extreme heat mitigation strategies and features speakers from Ramey and Associates, the California Department of Public Health, and the California Department of Insurance. My name is Kim Clark. I'm a planning supervisor in resource conservation and resilient communities at SCAG, and I'll be kicking off today's session before I hand things over to our speakers. While we preview the session, I encourage you to introduce yourself and say hi to each other in the chat. So just some meeting housekeeping first. Today's session will be about an hour and a half. There will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end of the session. If you have a question during the presentation, we encourage you to type it into the chat and we'll voice them at the end of the session. Today's meeting will be recorded, and presentations and session recordings will be posted on SCAG's website and sent to everyone who registered for the event. And now I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We are currently on occupied and unceded land of Indigenous peoples who are and have been the traditional caretakers of the land in this region. I am calling in from Cahuilla land. If you haven't already, I encourage you all to visit the resources shared in the chat to learn more about the land and Indigenous communities where you live. As this session is part of our equity series of Toolbox Tuesdays, I'd like to frame it within SCAG's equity efforts. In July 2020, SCAG's Regional Council adopted a resolution affirming its commitment to advancing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout Southern California. This led to the development of a working definition of racial equity and the Racial Equity Early Action Plan. This early action plan included 4 goals and 3 strategies to advance racial equity through SCAG's policies, practices, and activities. One of the goals is to encourage racial equity in local planning practices, which is what we aim to do through these equity-focused Toolbox Tuesday sessions. Some additional offerings that we've had in the past are listed on this slide, and you can access these previous Toolbox Tuesday sessions through the link in the chat. Now we'd like to give the audience a chance to do and provide more information on their background and work related to extreme heat, which we'll do through a quick poll. There are 3 poll questions, so I'll give everyone a minute to fill those out. Please make sure to scroll down through the poll to make sure you answer all 3 questions before pressing submit. Okay, great, thanks very much. Let's go ahead and end the poll. And thanks all for completing it. Great. Now let's go through our agenda. Our first presentation will be from Walker Wells of Ramey and Associates, then Maithili Ramachandran of the California Department of Public Health, followed by Rabab Sharafuddin at the California Department of Insurance. If you have questions during the presentation, as I mentioned, please type it into the chat box and we'll voice them during the Q&A panel at the end of the Toolbox Tuesday session. First, Walker Wells is a principal at Ramey and Associates. He is an industry-leading expert in sustainability, green building, renewable energy, and climate resilience. Walker works with local governments, affordable housing developers, and community-based organizations to further sustainable development practices via technical assistance, charrettes, workshops, and certification support. He is a co-author of Blueprint for Greening Affordable Housing and a lecturer in green urbanism at the Claremont Colleges and the UCLA Urban Planning Program. Next is Maithili Ramachandran, who is a climate and health economist at the Office of Health Equity within the California Department of Public Health. She specializes in the evaluation of public policies in the realm of health and schooling and in quantifying the impacts of climate change on population health. She has worked previously at the University of California, Riverside, the Poverty Action Lab in South Asia, and as a consultant to the World Bank office in Nepal. Maithili holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Riverside. And finally is Rabab Sharafuddin, who is a climate risk specialist at the California Department of Insurance, focusing on devising and implementing climate and sustainability policies and programs. Rabab managed the Extreme Heat Protection Gap Study and oversaw the study's economic analysis on the impacts of past extreme heat events in California. Prior to her position at CDI, Rabab was a biomedical researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, studying the role of the cell skeleton in genetic brain disorders. Within that, I'll now hand it over to Walker to give us our first presentation. Walker?
Okay, thanks, Kim. And great to be here, see all of you. And Walker Wells with Ramey Associates. And my background is urban planning. So I think a lot about sort of land use and what cities can do, all in this context of sort of climate adaptation. And then quite a bit of my work is also dealing with, greenhouse gas mitigation and then looking at this parallel world of resilience and adaptation. What I wanted to do was just provide some examples of things that can be done in the built environment to mitigate the impacts of urban heat and increasing urban heat. So we can go to the next slide. There we go. Moving me along here. Okay, just a little, since I'm going first, I thought I'd do a little bit of just framing. So a lot of what I'm talking about, at least today, is sort of urban conditions and urban heat conditions. And many of us are aware of this urban heat island effect, but just thought it bears a little bit of repeating that, yes, things get hotter in urban areas because there are dark surfaces, which can be rooftops or parking lots, that absorb heat rather than reflect heat. We have a lot of dense materials like concrete that also holds the heat for a long time and will continue to radiate it for hours after even when the sun has gone down. We'll have fewer trees, so we have fewer trees doing evapotranspiration or other green spaces that are doing evapotranspiration. And as you can see, this can result in 7 degrees difference between a rural area and an urban area in terms of just the background heat condition, which imagine we'll hear some more about this from the other speakers, which can contribute to a whole range of health concerns related to heat exposure. So we're trying to find in that kind of area that says downtown or urban residential, like what are the kind of things that can be done to basically bring down the temperature or make high levels of heat or extreme heat more bearable. Next slide. This is here to just say it's anticipated that things will get hotter, whether we have the lower level of GHG emissions that are modeled or the higher level, the temperatures are supposed to increase. And, it wasn't so terrible here, at least in the larger part of Southern California, but, I think Phoenix had, more than 100 days in a row of temperatures over 100 degrees, which, I think wears at people physically, but also emotionally, psychologically. And Phoenix has kind of been at the forefront of quite a bit of this thinking, and I think has some reasonable lessons to learn. But anyway, the trend is towards higher temperatures, so we need to take action. Next slide. Then I think this is just to show some, intuitive adaptive strategies. This looks, like some kids playing with water and umbrella, but, the girl is creating shade and then the boy is probably not knowing it, doing some type of evaporative cooling, off of his skin in that splash guard. They're also having some fun, but you can see we're clever and we look at how to adapt. Then we go to the next slide. And I think we can say, at the foundation of all of this is the information, which, I feel is, evolving to the point when it's pretty good about getting the heat advisories. I certainly get stuff on my phone. I'm part of LARC, which is over there on the left-hand image, the Regional Climate Collaborative that's been working with LA County Public Health on a heat sort of preparation and mitigation campaign. And then this is just an example from one of the cities in the Skag region, Montebello, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that sort of have a similar aesthetic look and feel, but basically telling people where to go. Go to the splash pad or go to the cooling center. It's activated. So we're sending that message, like, get yourself out of the heat, protect yourself. You can go to the next slide. And so in looking at what we can do in the built environment, there's just a few basics. We can go to the next slide about sort of how things work. So we're in the northern hemisphere. So it means that we get more sun from the south. And this all feels pretty rudimentary, but it's good to remind people. So, if you're designing a building, you actually would prefer to have the larger part of the building to be facing south so you can do things to mitigate the solar heat gain. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the north side isn't going to get much sun at all. And then the east and the west get tricky because the sun is low in the sky and it like comes in sort of sideways into buildings. West facing glass is very challenging. And then on the right side, this is a windrose that just shows you the direction of the wind, over the course of the day. And so, in this case, the wind is largely coming from the west. So that would influence where you would put your windows if you were really thinking about these types of things. So you would get the pressure of the wind coming from the west and flowing into your space, and then having some place for it to exhaust on the other side. You can go to the next slide. This just shows a little bit more what all of that means with that azimuth of the sun type of stuff. So if you look over on the left, showing you basically that there's this steep angle in the summer, which can be blocked by an overhang. And then in the winter, it's a more shallow angle, so you can get light and even heat into your space if you design these overhangs correctly. In many instances, these overhangs are put on buildings as an architectural feature. I've seen them on the north side of buildings. So I'm like, well, that's not doing anything, but it does look nice. But if designed correctly, it's a passive strategy that's just part and parcel of the building, which is a bit of a theme here. Like, how do we get these strategies just integrated, infused into the way that we think about planning and building design? And then you see over on the right side, types of ventilation. Cross ventilation, if you have a thin floor plate, you can have a low window or a window that can be open on the bottom on the high pressure side where it says cross ventilation, and then a higher window on the other side so the air can get out and the air will naturally move through. Or you can have this stack effect, which you'd give the hot air a place to go, which would be an operable skylight. Otherwise, it just builds up in there and makes everything hot. So some basics. You can go to the next slide. Okay, the rest of this, it sort of shows urban scale strategies and building scale strategies. So I'm just going to go through some examples. Next slide. So I'm not talking about trees. Trees are great. And we should plant as many of them as we possibly can. But they take a long time to get big enough to make sufficient shade or be pushing enough water to really make a difference from an evapotranspiration standpoint. If you look at that heat increase chart, things are moving along fairly rapidly in the increase in temperature. So yes, plant trees, but that's like a 25, 40-year investment. I'm looking at things we can do right away. So shade, fairly straightforward to implement. And here's just a few examples of, shade sails that can be put up. Can go to the next slide. Pergolas, another shade application. You can go to the next slide. And then a canopy, pavilion type of a thing, again, to provide shade over a, an outside dining area. And I think, it's relatively straightforward to put these shade structures up, and a number have been put up over playgrounds, but it's another question that I don't think has been fully explored about how do we put up a significant amount of shade structures over sidewalks where we're touching the public right of way. Like the shade that we have out there, pretty minimal, but it will be the bus shelters typically, or a tree. And you'll see people huddled in the shadow of the tree, see people in the shadow of the palm tree, as well as, in the bus shelter when there is one. So I think there's a question, how do we take some of the shade ideas that have come up in playgrounds or schools and look at implementing them, along the sidewalks, as sort of a refuge for people who need to be in public space. Next slide. Here we go. And then here's something a little more fundamental. I sort of got this thinking from Stephanie Pincel, who teaches at UCLA, and she's part of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. But she's often talked about, looking backwards to see how we built buildings before air conditioning was invented or prevalent. And so we have examples, around the state and certainly around the world of this sort of arcade type of a condition. This is Ojai. And you end up being in this area of the sidewalk that sort of inherently has shade because you've built this structure over it. There's pieces of this in Venice Beach and some other examples, but I think today building this type of building might have challenges again because of the relationship between the private space and the public space and its regulation. And like, I'm not even sure if you could do this building in many places today, but it inherently provides that protection from the direct sun just by the shape and design of the building itself. Next slide. Next is water. So yes, fountains are pretty, but the other thing they're doing is they're putting moisture, water into the air, and that moisture, those droplets of water can absorb heat. And then if there's a breeze, it can move them, away from where the people are. But so this is a decorative function, psychological relief, I think, from heat, but it has a practical function of putting moisture into the air that can then transfer the heat and absorb some of the heat. Next slide. It's going to be in different forms. You're sort of a nature park with a splash pad. You can go to the next slide. This is the fountain, over by the county government center. You see DWP in the back up there on the top left. It's become a super popular, super activated kind of community space, but it's also a place to cool down. And then the picture on the right is seen things like this when I've been in Phoenix, where you'll be in Tempe, where you'll be in a public space. I mean, you'll be in a private space, a restaurant that can have these misters, but I've seen some that are actually focused on the public right of way, the sidewalks, also, to cool you down. And it's the same thing. It's capturing moisture. It's also putting a small amount of water on your skin that's taking heat off your body and blowing it off with evaporative cooling. This works great in areas with dry heat because you can move moisture. If you're in a high humidity area, it's not going to be as effective. Next slide. Integration of green spaces. So here's a classic here on the left. This is the Emerald Necklace in Boston that wraps around from there at the bottom left, the Arboretum, and makes this kind of arch all the way down into Back Bay and in towards Boston Common. But it's this sort of integrated series of open space corridors and larger green spaces and waterways that sort of frames the city, but again provides this sort of cooling function at the same time. So it's managing floodwater, and it's also dealing with urban heat, and it's recreation. It does a whole bunch of interesting things. And then on the right, just an example of how green space can also be integrated into, in this case, like a very regimented street grid here in San Diego. But, South Park has all of these ravines that you get down into that ravine and the temperature drops, and, there's sort of almost like a wind that's created due to the temperature variation. So there's this example, and I just have a couple others. Now, of course, what I'm trying to do is spark the imagination and say, where might our green corridors be in Southern California? And obviously, it's the San Gabriel River, it's the LA River, it's the Arroyo Seco, it's Compton Creek, it's the tributaries to the LA River. These could all be at least conceptualized as, types of green corridors, that could kind of break up the grid, but, provide some of this cooling relief. You can go to the next slide. Just a story in the New York Times on Sunday about Toronto's ravines, sort of similar effect as we saw in San Diego, that kind of woven into the street grid are all of these pretty significant shaded open spaces that have been protected, but then also think thoughtfully treated in terms of having access to them. So not just sort of a leftover vestigial piece of open space, but something that's been thoughtfully woven into the rest of the city. You go to the next slide. This is in Portland. So just to show at a different scale, having green space and water. And then in this case, it's also doing stormwater management. The designer is Drysidle Studio, who's done a lot of these sort of multi-layered open space, green spaces. But, this was a sort of parking lot area. So, while it may be hard to deconcrete all of our tributary streams, we do have asphalt covered parking lots that potentially optimistically could be, small pocket park neighborhood green spaces. Next slide. And even these tiny guys make a difference, a little place to sit in the shade. I'm not sure what that chairlift is about, but I guess it's a place to hang out. But, this is a place likely absorbing some stormwater, light colored surfaces, some shade, place to sit. But I'm always interested in these sort of small interventions that I think can actually make quite a difference. We sometimes feel like it needs to be a big green space or a whole park, but I think some of these small, almost sort of surgical or urban acupuncture type of strategies can be quite successful. Next slide, please. And then green space that's also multifunctional. So these are different stormwater management strategies, but they do put green materials that are doing evapotranspiration and not absorbing, heat into the urban environment, whether it's a bioswale on the left or a rain garden down at the bottom right, or just this sort of grasscrete, concrete pavers mixed with grass, you know, as a way to provide a drivable area, but most of the time to also have the green space and not have it just be fully paved. So these are sort of smaller scale interventions. Next slide. Okay, on to ventilation. I thought this was pretty wild. I think this is from Valencia, not up by Santa Clarita, Spain. That happened as part of a world's exposition, but these are stack effect thermal chimneys that were installed into this park. So these are designed to capture hot air and like suck it up and spin it out, and basically to create a breeze by the virtue of the shape of these towers. So, and integrated into an open space, but really a passive cooling strategy. And then there's another image on the next slide of a more recent design. Sorry, forgetting where this is from, but similar ideas of being able to use just air buoyancy as a way to move heat away from people, and or create a breeze. So, the heat affects us, but also, the humidity and then the air velocity. So, if you can just create a breeze, there's some sense of relief, even if the temperature doesn't change. You can go to the next slide. Then this next piece, and then I have a little wrap-up slide, just talks about things one can do with the building scale. Next slide. So first, there's sort of this building orientation and form, some of these strategies. So put the buildings on an east-west axis, try to minimize windows facing west, because that's where you get the greatest solar heat gain. Window overhangs on the south, fins or trees on east and west, narrow floor plates, designed for passive ventilation, and integrate courtyards and plazas, which is another way to have some green space and some water that can also provide some relief from the heat. So we can just go to the next slide. So ideally, you're about 15 degrees off of south, either east or west. That's sort of the ideal orientation of a building, if you can do it. Sometimes the blocks are not set up that way, or your parcel isn't set up that way, but so it'd be a first step as a designer concerned about heat gain, is to say, can I get, the long side of my building facing south? And then on the right part of the slide, you just see this strategy of putting deciduous trees, on the south or southwest facade. And so in the summer, they would have leaves and provide shade. And in the winter, the light would be able to come through. And some of you could get some natural heat gain in the winter. Next slide. Overhangs and fins. So we already talked about the image on the left to show you how to do it. And then on the right, you just see an example of these being installed, and, from what I can tell, installed correctly, because you can see the shadow that's being created by the combination of the overhang and the fin across the window. So it's not the whole window, but it's quite a good portion of the window. And so these, I think, were thoughtfully placed. This is what is it, the West Village development in Davis, California, which has a number of net zero buildings and passive design strategies. So not surprised that these were done, correctly and that they're effective. Next slide. It's another image of the overhangs and the fin you can see over there on the left side of the building. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the narrow floor plates. So this is roughly 40 feet is the maximum you want to have for a floor plate so that you can get what you're seeing here is light coming from both sides and the ability to have the light penetrate into the space, which is more of a green building thing, but also if you have operable windows to create the potential for there to be cross ventilation. Gets wider than that, it just stops working. And so this is in an office environment. If we go to the next slide and see an affordable housing development, one of the first project I worked on from a green building standpoint in Santa Cruz, and you see the building volume kind of at the top part of the slide that it's, consists of a number of sort of thin building volumes to provide exactly those same functions, light, but also the ability to do cross ventilation. Next slide. And then this is evaporative cooling. So this tower isn't sucking the air up. What's happening is on that little V thing at the top, there's some water that's put in there, that's sprayed in there. And so that hits the air, makes the air heavier, and it sinks and goes into the building and cools off the building. So it's using a different form of air buoyancy or the temperature differentiation, or just the simple act of, adding some water to the air and using that to do some very sort of low energy use cooling, using some of these fundamental properties of physics. Next slide. Cool roofs, pretty straightforward. The does not absorb heat. It does reflect the heat. So the heat doesn't really go away. It just doesn't end up in the building. So at the roof level, having a white roof seems to be a natural. You don't get the heat buildup in the attic or on the top of the roof pushing into the building. We go to the next slide. You can see these light colored surfaces, same things happens. It bounces the heat, but if you're walking on it, like the ground isn't hot, but the air can still be warm because it's bouncing in at you. So I think this is a thing where you start to look at stuff in combination, light colored surfaces with shade, for example, or with the introduction of water. But Climate Resolve nonprofit here in LA has really been out at the forefront of talking about these cool surfaces, and I think made quite a bit of progress in showing how they can be applied, again, in public rights of way, in municipal conditions. Next slide. A few examples of courtyards and the introduction of water. Fairly straightforward, but a small green space, but that also has the benefit of introducing water and water's ability to hold heat and move heat and almost create a breeze around the fountain. Next slide. This is the Santa Monica Public Library. Over there on the right, there's a little runnel is the name for it, this little piece of water. It's not a splashy fountain, but there is some water in there, along with the shade overhang, and you start to see these pieces fitting together. Next slide. And so here's my conclusion. You're going to design for cooling, understand the local climate conditions, where are you relative to the sun, what's really what's up with humidity, can you do evaporative cooling because it's dry heat, or is it, not really a great strategy if it's too humid? Where's the prevailing winds coming from? Bring those passive strategies into the fundamental building design, orientation of the building, placement of windows, window overhangs, ability for air to come out, say through operable skylights. Work with nature, which is really with water and some of the low impact development type of approaches to, yes, capture and clean stormwater, but also to create green space. I've always been a fan of these multiple benefit strategies, one intervention that can do multiple things, and then to think at multiple scales. So, looking at those rivers and tributaries, that's regional, that's even beyond, city scale. And then we have city scale parks, these neighborhood scale, small interventions, tactical urbanisms, and then what can you do at the site? And then, what's sort of inherent in the building? And I think to kind of move across that spectrum can precipitate a lot of the best or the most innovative or, again, sort of multi-benefit strategies. So that's what I wanted to share with all of you. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Walker. And as a reminder to folks, if you have questions for Walker, please do put them in the chat. At the end of the session, there will also be an opportunity to raise your hand and voice questions as well. Next, we'll move on to Maithili Ramachandran from the Office of Health Equity within the California Department of Public Health. Maithili?
Thank you, Kim. And so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to SCAD for extending me an invitation to present today. I'm very happy to be here. I thought I would speak about two relatively well-studied health impacts of extreme heat, and then the effort to value these impacts in economic terms, and then the types of policy guidance that the Department of Public Health provides on heat-proofing communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so this graph is just a quick look at temperature in California and the long-term trend. Probably not something you need to be convinced that extreme heat is happening and we're experiencing it. Nevertheless, good to take a look at data just to see how far temperatures have changed over time. So the orange spike line, that plots the annual average temperatures starting in 1895, and this ends in 2023. And then the blue line shows a trend in this temperature. The black line represents average temperature in the 20th century. So it's pretty clear, I think, that California has been warming over time, especially if you look at the gap between the black and the blue lines. You see it's really widening towards the end of this time period. And instead of looking at annual temperatures, if we actually only looked at summer temperatures, that would be the months between June and August in the Northern Hemisphere. And we would get a very similar picture as this graph. And in fact, by that measure, this past summer was the hottest ever for California in the last 130 years, which is to say, ever since the US began to maintain weather records. So we experience all of this warming as an increasing number of very hot days and increasingly warm nights. And all of this has thrown up a number of public health challenges. I'll get into a couple of those in the following slides. Next slide, please. So there are several health outcomes affected by extreme heat. One of those is health at birth. Many studies report a negative relationship between heat and birth weight, but they do not necessarily capture the causal effect of heat on birth weight. So while I was at the University of California, Riverside, my co-authors and I conducted this study to quantify the causal impact of extreme heat exposure on birth weight. And we focused very specifically on California and broadly tried to relate impacts to what kind of exposure was avoidable or not avoidable. Next slide, please. So very quickly, what our study did was combine hospital data from the Department of Healthcare Access and Information. We had 11 million birth observations in this hospital data set that spanned the years 1991 through 2011. We combined this with weather data that we took from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So the network of weather stations in California provides the temperature and precipitation records publicly. We also had controls for some measures of air pollution like ozone. So we made sure to measure the prenatal exposure, both by trimester and at the zip code level, to try and get as refined a measure of the exposure as possible. And then we basically carried out a regression technique with fixed effects and clustering for spatial correlation. So anyway, I'll get into the results. Next slide, please. So our study found that in utero exposure reduced birth weight, and most of the action was concentrated in the second trimester. We found that each day of extreme heat exposure in the second trimester depressed birth weight by 22 grams. So for reference, the average birth weight in the study sample was around 3,300 grams. And if we were to extrapolate that 22 grams to, let's say, consider like a 3-day heat wave in the second trimester, then that would amount to a total reduction of 66 grams, which was roughly 2% of average birth weight. We also found that extreme heat reduced birth weight even more if the second trimester happened to coincide with the cool months of the year, like December through February. So we found that it was not only important to avoid or minimize exposure to extreme heat during peak summer in the typical times of the year that's considered hot, but it's also important to guard against unseasonably high temperatures. And lastly, our study also detected disproportionate negative impacts in zip codes with relatively high shares of outdoor workers. So if you're unable to avoid exposure simply because your occupation has to be performed outdoors, then you are more vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat. Next slide, please. So the Department of Public Health has a number of easily accessible resources online for heat proofing in general. And this particular page offers guidance on safe pregnancies during periods of extreme heat. Next slide, please. And in addition, the Department of Public Health also has its own heat risk grid, which is a tool that it has adapted from the National Weather Service. And this is a bilingual tool. It is meant to be a forecast of upcoming heat health risks. So the risk gradient is color-coded from green to magenta. I know it's not very easy to look at this slide and absorb this information, but this is available on the department's website. So it is a very accessible tool in the sense that it can be consulted by pretty much anyone. The average citizen should be able to look at this if they so wish for awareness, basic precautions that would be good to take depending on what an upcoming heat event calls for. And it's also useful to local planners in terms of long-term planning for the protection of various demographic groups expected to be vulnerable to extreme heat. Next slide, please. So I want to now turn to a different health outcome that is also connected to extreme heat, and that is excess mortality. What do we mean by excess mortality? So in any given period, there is a certain number of expected deaths simply based on historical trends in a given region, in a given place and time, and that includes trends in temperature and all of that. But then there's an actual number of deaths that transpires. And if the actual number of deaths is greater than the expected number of deaths in a place in a given time period, then that is termed excess mortality. This particular measure has become more salient during heat waves. So for example, the 2023 CDPH report that looked at the 10-day heat wave in September of 2022, it found that up to 395 deaths could be attributed to the heat wave. So this was the size of excess mortality that heat wave brought. And so when the outcomes of extreme heat range from loss of birth weight to a premature end of life, and a lot of things in between, the basic challenge is how we try to minimize these diverse adverse impacts with limited resources. In the case of excess mortality, the policy questions are, what can the state do to prevent such deaths, and how much should it spend? So one way we could try to answer this is with metrics like the value of a statistical life, and that's called VSL for short. So VSL is a way to understand what the collective amount that society might be willing to pay to reduce mortality just a little bit. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recommends a certain VSL from time to time, and in 2019 dollars, this figure was roughly $11 million. So if we did a rough and ready calculation by applying this estimate to 395 deaths from the 22 September heat wave, that would suggest that the state's spending up to $4 billion to prevent those heat-related deaths would be acceptable. So this calculation obviously is approximate because it is not adjusting the VSL for the median life expectancy or the demographic structure of the population in California, or how VSL even changes with things like income. Next slide, please. So in terms of dealing with heat mortality in the future, there are a number of challenges. It's a pretty involved and enormous research project, but we could knock the basic task into probably 5 categories. And that roadmap would look something like this. We could start with the output of climate models and look at what they project for future heat waves in California. And then we could try and look at a number of research studies that calculate what the excess mortality is likely to be for those sorts of heat waves. And then applying techniques like VSL, this would give us an estimate of the benefits of avoiding that projected mortality. So finally, we can compare the benefits captured using VSL to program costs of adaptation and prevention. And basically, comparing these benefits and costs allows us to advance climate action by showing that it yields net benefits to society. The basic challenge, of course, is to find a blend of climate health actions that do yield net benefits, because as we will see, several programs have different timelines, costs, and benefits, and it's a question of how do we choose among them to try and maximize the return to our resources. Next slide, please. Now, there are several programs that can effectively heat-proof communities, and I've only selected 3 examples on this slide. These are home weatherization, urban greening, and measures to protect worker health during extreme heat. So like I said before, one question before society is how we prioritize among these programs, since many of these have they call for different sorts of investment from the public and maybe the private sector. It's a question also of the implementation timeline. Nevertheless, each of them offers health benefits. So the best way that we could try to get the most out of our resources is to put them towards programs that deliver the highest net benefits. So for health economists like me, that would involve comparing those social benefits against program costs, so the Department of Public Health can identify which strategies will heat-proof communities in California cost effectively and rapidly under climate change. And these are also programs where the Department of Public Health has offered input and is actively engaged in trying to pilot some of these at a local level to study the costs and benefits more thoroughly. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions now, or of course, at the end of the talks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike Daly. And as a reminder, feel free, folks, to put your questions in the chat. Now moving on to Rabab Sharafeddin, who is coming from the Department of Insurance. Rabab?
Yes, hi. Thank you all. Thank you for having me. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, great. Um, thank you, Skag, for having me, and hi, everyone. I'm glad to be with you here today to talk about the recent analysis that the California Department of Insurance released in July in collaboration with Industrial Economics, which is an economic research firm. And the study estimates the uninsured and insured cost of seven recent extreme heat events across California. And really looking at it from this uninsured insured cost is looking at it from a protection gap lens of extreme heat, basically what is covered by insurance and what is not covered by insurance, to better understand our current financial and economic resilience to extreme heat. Now, this study was a recommendation from the Climate Insurance Working Group and an important component from the AB 2238 law, which Commissioner Lara sponsored, that establishes an extreme heat ranking system for the state. So just as a bird's eye view, in total, the economic impacts across all seven studied extreme heat events amounted to $7.7 billion, affecting nearly the entire population of California. And most of these costs are uninsured. And before I break it down, I just wanted to show a little bit of why this study is unique, and it is unique for different reasons. First, it takes a comprehensive retrospective look at different types of economic and financial impacts, and it examines also the costs of these impacts at an event specific level. So it's not annual cost, it's specific events cost. And it also covers most of the geographic locations and populations across California. And the graph on the right shows that these 7 events were selected out of 100 events that I identified in the past 10 years. So these events are not happening in the vacuum. And as the previous speakers have mentioned, is that this is gonna this increase in temperature, both intensity and frequency, is gonna increase in time. So just a little bit about these 7 events. They include, as you can see here with the maps of the heat maps of the number of days and the location of these events, or the geographical exposure of these events. They differ in their geographic coverage, the number of people living within the area of the extreme heat event, and overall the magnitude and intensity of the impact. And you'll see unsurprisingly later, as we break it down, is that the longer the event and the more people are exposed to it, the higher the economic impacts. So let's dig in. And as we all know, and we've seen also previously, that extreme heat impacts various aspects of our lives, from our health to our work, to how we get to work. So working with IEC, we focused on quantifying different sectors, focusing on health and safety, the economy, energy, and infrastructure. There was some qualitative analysis on governance impacts that I will talk about a little later. But these and also some qualitative indicators. But the bar graph on the right represents the share of the quantified costs per event within these sectors that I mentioned. And unsurprisingly, the sector that was affected the most was health and safety, which was followed by the economy, and then electricity or energy, and finally infrastructure. The economic costs of each event range from a high of over $3 billion for the widespread effects of the 2022 inland coastal event, to affecting more than 34 million people over 14 days, to the 240 million for a more spatially limited 2013 Eastern California event, affecting around 3 million people over 9 days. So let's kind of focus on each sector, and I'll start with the health and safety. And as I said, the health and safety sector had the biggest impact. That included 460 deaths across all the events, as well as more than 138,000 outpatient visits, 10,600 emergency department visits, 500, sorry, nearly 5,000 hospitalizations, as well as 344 adverse birth outcomes. And vulnerable populations were hit the hardest. For example, premature mortality here concentrated among older populations. Black, Native American, and white Hispanic populations had a higher estimated mortality rates from extreme heat compared to Asian and white non-Hispanic populations. In some cases, mortality rates were twice as high. Also not shown here in a graph, but 6 of the events showed mortality rates higher in disadvantaged community tracts or the Cal Enviro screen SBS 535 criteria that range between 14 to 30% higher than non-disadvantaged community tracts. And looking also more closely at the healthcare costs, you see here it's the costs for hospitalizations, emergency department visits, and outpatient visits look similar to how mortality rates also looked, but the costs here where we'll see, even though there's less hospitalizations than any other sort of public healthcare service, it costs more per hospitalization than any kind of service. So you'll see a representation of hospitalizations and costs as well. And I would also like to point out for outpatient visits, these are specifically just Center for Medicare and Medi-Cal data. So this is just data from public insurance databases and does not include private insurance and other types of coverage. So let's look specifically at how these type of coverages look, and a little bit deeper into the hospitalizations and emergency department visits. Now, for emergency heat-related illnesses, unlike mortality, the illnesses were concentrated among younger populations, and over 50% of hospitalizations and nearly 2/3 of emergency department visits involved Black, Native American, white, Hispanic, and Asian populations, exceeding what their population share in the state. And when we look at health insurance specifically, for hospitalization and emergency department visits, fewer than 30% had private insurance. It's actually 17% for hospitalizations, with Medicare and Medi-Cal covering 60 to 80% of these patients. Now we're going to look at the economy sector and dig in deeper there. And extreme heat impacts can reduce economic output across various sectors, especially sectors that are exposed to high temperatures and humidity. And you'll see here these costs are distributed, and they're, as I mentioned, the impacts are going to be specific also to where the location is. And as we go from coastal events inland, we'll see the type of sectors impacted differ. So the study looked at manufacturing productivity, crop productivity, dairy cow mortality, and dairy productivity. And we see from looking from the coast, manufacturing productivity was impacted the hardest, and that kind of switches to crop productivity and dairy cow mortality and productivity as we go inland. In fact, the manufacturing sector, even though it was estimated to experience the largest losses, when we look at individual events, we'll see that, for example, in the 2022 coastal inland event, it had the highest combined costs, while the 2017 Central Valley event saw the greatest losses in dairy productivity and cow mortality, which is due to its location in agricultural regions. Now, much of these losses are uninsured, except for maybe crop insurance and dairy productivity as well. But even then, not everything is covered. Specialty crops, for example, are not covered. And another thing that is not covered, that is also is disrupted, is expected income for workers. Qualitatively, the study showed that workers have increased workplace injuries during extreme heat events, but they also have their income is disrupted during these events, and that ranges from 210 million to 200,000 per event. Looking at energy, so extreme heat does impact energy, how we use energy, and also increases power outages. And the study quantified these power outages and showed that the extreme heat power outages costs due to extreme heat ranged from 240 million for example, for the coastal inland event, and then and hovered on average of 50 million per the other events. Now, we also wanted to look at not only the cost of power outages, but we all use more electricity when extreme heat, when we're experiencing a heat wave. And because of these complexities in pricing, we weren't able to quantify these increases. But I just wanted to share an illustrative example here. For example, in Pasadena, which is one of the zip codes that was most responsive to heat, it experienced 111 days above 90 degrees in 2022, leading to a residential household spending of an average of $75 more in electricity expenditures than they would have in days if those days were 80 to 90 degrees. So on average, a household is spending $75 more because of increase in extreme heat days. And also extreme heat days extreme heat days are correlated with flex alerts as well. You see here, flex alerts are alerts that California ISO issues to ask residents to reduce the amount of electricity they're using. And the study shows that these correlate with extreme heat events, specifically the ones that we studied as well. So in terms of quantification, last but not least, I'm going to talk about infrastructure, and we'll see how that impacts specifically local governments as well. So for the infrastructure impacts, the study looked at, in addition to aircraft losses, it also looked at road damages and as well as rails damages and delay to passengers. And this graph on the right, on the left, shows the cost of damage repairs and delays to passengers. And the bigger the circle, the more miles are affected. And you see here, even though there's way more road miles affected, the cost for rails actually is larger. Also due mostly to delay in passenger delays costs. And when we look at where these roads are and who's responsible for repairing them, they're usually local governments. And we see here for the 7 events, most of the impacted roads are city roads and county roads. And the study really tried to qualitatively look at local governments and how they experience extreme heat. And just to point out, three different avenues of how extreme heat can be experienced or impact local governments. And one of starting with increased demand for services, an example is what we just saw earlier, road repair costs. But also we saw even earlier, is costs that are captured in the health and safety sector, which is first responder costs are also captured in this and can also fall on local governments. Another thing that was captured also in this study in the economic impact sector is tax revenues, because many of the economic impacts are measuring lost GDP. Tax revenues are also included, and they will impact local governments as well. So alongside of the study, the department also surveyed local governments and asked them about their own experience with extreme heat, specifically how it impacts their operations. And this spring, actually, SCAG was kind enough and helpful to iterate on the survey and also help deploy it. We got 18 responses from local governments, mainly from counties. You see here in the map on the right. And when we asked local governments how does extreme heat events impact their operations, they mentioned that there is increase in electric bills, use of backup generators, increase in wear and tear of public infrastructure, as well as increase in visits to community health clinics, just to name a few. And this survey also had some interesting anecdotal experiences from local governments. So for LA County Fire has reported that for each major heat risk, level 3 days as classified by the National Weather Service, it caused an estimated of 115 additional calls for emergency medical services. And each extreme heat level 4 days, it causes 152 additional calls compared to match days with no or minimal heat risk. And in 2022, these additional calls amounted to $2 million for emergency medical services. Madera County also mentioned that they applied for assistance through the California Disaster Assistance Act program to cover costs incurred due to a declared wildfire emergency following an extreme heat event in 2022. And I like these two examples because they illustrate the compounding or the cascading impacts of extreme heat, both impact on other disasters like we'll seeing in wildfire, but also on healthcare. So the additional phone calls, let's say for emergency medical services, the LA County is reported, it really shows the interconnectedness both with governance, infrastructure, and healthcare. Emergency medical services need roads to get to patients, and patient needs roads and rails to get to hospitals. And for healthcare providers, it also needs infrastructure to be able to get to work, and also energy to be able to protect the equipment and supplies and hospitals and clinics. So keeping this in mind, these costs, and I'm so thankful that I'm last because I feel like there's a lot of setup for many of my slides, but these costs are not inevitable. We can reduce them and help save lives through risk reduction measures and interventions. And they're proof. So that's why in the report, we try to have a small section of preliminary cost benefit analysis of extreme heat intervention. And it includes examples of planting trees in Los Angeles County or evaporative cooling for dairy in the Central Valley that I would invite anyone interested to check it out. And I'll share the report with you after I finish. But also the report looked at heat action plans, and we in the survey we did ask local governments about their experience with heat action plans. And more than half of respondents said they are working on or have developed heat action plans or response plans. And their plans, they said their plans included public health warnings, cooling centers, in-home supportive services, and transportation services. And before I end, I just also wanted to talk a little bit about the recommendations. We talked about interventions, talked about strategies, but I really want to focus here just from an insurance perspective. So as an insurance regulator, looking at how insurance can enhance financial and economic resiliency of communities and local governments is insurance can really play a role, both through incentivizing heat health reduction strategies. So we'll see that much of the health impacts were covered by public and private programs. But these programs can help invest in heat impact reduction in heat mitigation strategies and measures. But also from a premium perspective, if we're looking at it from that sense, because insurers are also invest their money, but they also get invest premiums, but also they can use premium reduction to incentivize better risk reduction measures for our heat resilience strategies. As an example, workers' compensation insurance can offer premium reductions for employers who are reducing heat risks to their employees above what is required by law. And last but not least, I come from the climate resiliency branch here at the California Department of Insurance, and we're really interested in conceptualizing and developing novel insurance mechanisms and pilot projects that are meant to help both local governments, meant to help communities, local governments, small and micro businesses really cover them and help protect them from heat, especially from the economic impacts of heat through different insurance mechanisms, specifically insurance mechanisms that are designed to for a quick and fast payout as the extreme heat event is happening in real time. I'll stop here. Thank you all for listening. This is my information, and I'm happy to join my fellow speakers in answering any questions.
Thanks very much for Bob. Let's see, we have a number of questions that are posted in the chat. I welcome everyone to continue posting questions. Our first question is for Walker. What can jurisdictions do to encourage the inclusion of heat mitigation strategies in building design? Have you seen examples of regulatory or incentive approaches, for instance?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think the regulatory approach that is probably most relevant is going to be energy reach codes. And so that would have at least the designers of new buildings thinking about all the strategies that they could feasibly incorporate, which would hopefully get to reduce energy use. So I would hope that would lead them towards thinking about natural ventilation and passive cooling, placement of fins and overhangs on windows, these types of things. So there's a bit of a prompt to, consider these actions. A challenge is that those elements of building design aren't reflected very well in the state's, approved energy models. So they focus more on equipment efficiency than on fundamental building design. But you can still pick some things up by reducing west-facing glass, for example. And then I think there's a making sure you're not preventing good things from happening strategy. So if you have design standards or guidelines that are limiting things like window overhangs because they're seen as a projection that's larger than an allowable projection. I've run across this, so like you can have a window overhang of, no more than 12 inches. So that's decorative, but it may not be big enough to actually provide the shading for the window. And then there's certainly plenty of places that have cool roof ordinances. So that in LA County is an example that has a cool roof ordinance and really a requirement that new roofs meet the cool roof standard. Then finally, this is to kind of was a little bit of breaking down the silos is, many local governments have objective design standards or developing them as a result of their, housing element updates. And there is the potential to fold in some of these environmental energy cooling strategies, into those design standards. So I think it's to just look a little more broadly than what may have been done around, I think, sort of form and aesthetics that happen within the objective design standards, and think about the sort of sustainability and climate related issues. And then I just say there's a whole bunch of interesting work that could be done to say, this question about introducing shade canopies in the public right of way and who's responsible for that and maintenance and safety. And like, that's a whole area of exploration that would be super interesting. Also looking at, that example from Ojai and saying, if somebody wanted to build a new arcaded building, what would that really take? And is it even allowable, within the current regulatory landscape? So I think there's some practical things that we can do right now and some interesting things to explore going forward.
Thanks very much. Let's see, this next question is for Maithili. Can you share any findings about what are the most cost-effective strategies? For instance, what are the lowest cost and highest return adaptation strategies that might need more study of some programs?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Kim, and thanks for that question. I would say, so this is not a question that has been answered in that there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. So some of it is ongoing within the state, and even within the academic literature, there is a lot of research that is just now starting to try and capture something like the cost benefits of planting more trees. And this is not just focused in California, but anywhere in the US. So it's really hard at this point to rank among these strategies which ones are the most cost effective. But I would say that across the board, the easiest, lowest hanging fruit for interventions is always providing information. And even though a lot of this could seem like common sense, it helps to tell people when there is a forecast saying there's going to be a heat wave coming to the state or a particular part of the state, just to remind them that there are certain basic precautions to take, maybe try to limit outdoor activity if it is optional. And now, of course, the state has put in place an indoor heat rule that says that workers in built environments, they cannot be asked to work if the indoor temperature goes above 85 Fahrenheit. So the employer is obliged to provide cooling periods and also have appropriate cooling strategies. So there are some things that the state has tried to do to advance, health protections in different ways. But I think so local jurisdictions, as much as they can be aware of these things that are already enforceable in the law, and what they can also provide as common sense precautions and reminders, those are the best ways to go about, I think, trying to safeguard public health.
Thanks very much. I'd like to direct that question to Rabab as well. What are some of the lowest cost and highest return adaptation strategies that might need more study?
Sorry. Yes, I agree with Maithili about the in terms of having educational campaigns, as well as kind of looking at the events before they happen, how we can prepare for them better, is educational campaigns, warning systems, working now, California is working on their own extreme heat ranking system, which would also help residents understand, the impacts of, what is, how the level of risk for an extreme heat event. And also, I think in general, from an insurance perspective, is looking at how we can approach, prevent the losses from happening before they happen. So have understanding who needs help, who needs in-home supportive services. Transportation services is another thing that comes up, is, cooling centers are there, but sometimes there's no way, there's limited support for transportation to cooling centers. So thinking how accessibility to cooling initiatives is also important. And I think that would be a point of study of how can we make things that are meant to help mitigate the risks accessible to folks.
Thanks very much. And as we're speaking on this, it's wonderful to see that there's been more concrete definitions of what extreme heat entails. Let's see, but can you define or operationalize extreme heat? Because we know there's different definitions from federal agencies, from state agencies, as well as institutes of public health. Just wanted to hear basically, how you're approaching the definition of extreme heat. And this is to everybody. It's a hard question.
I can offer a first response. I'm sure others probably have better responses to this, but I think extreme heat. So extreme heat is actually, yes, in terms of both, the climate scientists and policymakers. There's really no consensus definition of extreme heat. So there are a number of different measures that have been developed to try and capture what extreme really is. And, in a probably not to anyone's surprise, it really is a matter of multiple variables. So it's not just temperature, it also includes humidity and something to capture how acclimated we are to these variables based on local distributions of temperature historically, like what that looks like. So extreme heat, I think there are alternate ways in which this has been measured, and this is reflected in a bunch of different tools that the state has and also the federal government has. So for example, like the National Weather Service, they did put together this heat risk grid that the Department of Public Health adapted. I think that has so far come out as the most digestible kind of extreme heat, definition, because it's trying to make it practical in terms of just what is the implication for you if you are living in a place where the heat event that you're going to see falls in one of these different ranks that is in the grid. And then what should you do? Just as a matter of practice, what precautions should you take? Rather than worry about whether it is 90 degrees Fahrenheit today, and that is really extreme, or is it that, unless it hits 100 at midday, I don't have to worry about exercising outdoors. So rather than think about it like that, the grid does the work of just telling you, with all the underlying weather conditions, is this a matter of concern for you given your age, your occupation? And so just what should you do in practice? So yeah, I think extreme heat is not really easy to agree on, but the same thing goes with heat waves. It's really no consensus definition for heat waves. It could be a 3 or 4 day or any number of days that you want to make a minimum cutoff.
Yeah, and I just say, when we're working with cities, and we're currently working with City of San Jose on their climate resilience plan, there's this understanding of the patterns of heat, but really what I feel like becomes even more important is understanding where the vulnerabilities are. And, so knowing that it's going to be hot for a long period of time is good, because you can send the messages out, but then you have to make sure those messages get to people, who don't have a car. So this access issue is really important. There can be a cooling center, but if the bus doesn't go to the cooling center and you don't have a car, then you're going to end up walking in the heat to get to the cooling center. And so, there's all of these like connections that have to happen in the sort of heat response system. Or there's people who, they're better if they stay at home, but you need to make sure that they have some form of cooling. So I know this is what kind of lifts out of all the analysis that gets done is I'm like, well, where are the people who are actually have exposure and high risk and therefore vulnerable? And then what are the measures to deal with them? Because like if I'm a middle-class person with a house with air conditioning, I'll just stay inside. Like I'm not going to have a heart attack. But if I'm not that person, and I think that's where it gets tricky is figuring out where those populations are and how to communicate with them. So it's kind of I guess there's the quantitative aspect of the temperature and the duration, and then there's this, I don't know if it's qualitative, but humanistic component of how are we protecting people.
So what I'm hearing is the characteristics of what would be extreme heat vary greatly when it comes to individual communities based on a number of factors. But then also, because of the challenges, the solutions vary to an extent for communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Mathilde brought up, weather stripping or weatherization, which, I'd left out. I thought I'd covered every possible strategy, but people in older houses that were built before the energy code came into effect in 1978, will not have insulation, will have single pane windows, they may not have air conditioning. These are all sort of measures that can be done at the building level that are sort of remedial, but can actually prevent it from getting so hot for so long. A thing that struck me is it's like it gets hot, but also doesn't cool down. I grew up in the Central Valley outside of Fresno. And so, the evenings, the temperature would drop and you could open the windows and cool down the house. But if it stays warm too late, then people sleep poorly and their core body temperature doesn't adjust. I mean, these are all the things we're learning. So then, yeah, like the mitigation strategy isn't an urban pocket park. It's really just basic weatherization of the home. And, in a sort of vicious circle, making sure they have some type of, mechanical cooling, which of course contributes to climate change if we don't have enough renewable energy, but dealing with the immediate issue of people being at risk, like, you do want to make an intervention is to give them a portable air conditioner. So ideally they'd have an efficient one and et cetera. But yeah, I think Kim, it's like you get into the people and community part, and there's a different approach that maybe gets taken onto these mitigation strategies.
And I just also wanted to add, just from a study perspective, because I agree with Walker and Matilde about, there's a qualitative element and there's quantitative element, but also sometimes, you have to, for example, for our study, we really needed a quantitative a definition, and we settled on, and there, like Matilde said, there's different sources of definitions, and I guess it also depends on what you're measuring and how you want to use what would be the most suitable for what you'll use that definition. For example, for us, it was we used the excess heat factor method, which is based on a 3-day averaged daily mean temperature and a calculation of apparent temperature that considers the impact of humidity and acclimatization, and also looks at acclimatization, which basically looks at how the temperature was over 3 days compared to the prior 30 days. So it was a very specific, but we had to do that for the study just to, for standardization.
Yeah, and then just brass tacks, like you also should be, if you're doing this planning at the local level, you should be thinking about where you might get funding to implement your plan. So if there's a state, public Department of Public Health standard or Housing Community Development standard, like you got to make sure you're complying with that. And if FEMA has something else, and you think it's going to be coming through, HUD and CBDG. So this is just being kind of smart about aligning the measures with the sources of funding that could help implement them.
Thanks very much. And I think it begs the question of understanding the science and then also understanding the community needs, especially given that, extreme heat will vary so much in communities and the solutions are going to vary so much in communities. So what do you think is the opportunities for engaging the community in helping understanding the challenges and then also helping to identify solutions?
Yeah, I'll just say, there's science, which we often think of as hard science, but like there's social science and as well. And, we know that communities can have a dynamic. So, one of the things that we learned at the different project in San Jose was that, it's this whole issue of the trusted voice. So where the city might, and we learned this in sort of the Vietnamese community in this community-based organization that we were coordinating with. And they said, people will hear a message from the city or the county, and then they will call us to see if it's true. And so I think, part of it is like, how do you get the messages about what to do and how to prepare and the severity of things, into the community in a way that it's absorbed and trusted and then actioned, which means understanding some of those, whatever it is, cultural, social, sort of neighborhood dynamics, which there are, tools to figure that out. Who are the trusted institutions? And often they're community-based organizations. So there's a, the strategy, maybe it's even a tactic, so there's my thought.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the stakeholders that we have on the line right now, largely drawing from local jurisdictions, community-based organizations, universities, as well as nonprofit organizations. I think it'd be helpful for us to ask our audience what barriers that they're facing in trying to help the most vulnerable communities. For instance, providing cooling centers at a minimum during heat waves, and how are they addressing the most vulnerable populations and what are their urgent needs, so that those areas can be addressed with more funding. So I'd like to pose that question to our audience, and I invite people to either raise their hand and share their experience and knowledge and know-how, or post comments into the chat. Let's see, Edgar is sharing. We've got a lot of comments coming in. That's wonderful. I'm seeing from Natalie Hernandez, the urgent needs are wage loss. When it's hot, people don't go to work, and especially if they can't because of illness. Enrique Huerta is sharing that two-tiered indoor worker heat standard says that 82 degrees and 87 degrees. 82 degrees requires employers to provide mandatory breaks and cool down spaces and access to water. And at 87 degrees, employers must have a method to keep that temperature from rising, either through mechanical cooling, passive cooling, cool roofs and walls, etc. So I'd like to invite people to share more in the chat while I have another question that I'd like to pose. Are there transit and transportation agency data collection or reporting standards for heat-related illnesses or deaths in vehicles, stations, and bus stops and stop locations to get a better understanding of where in the system heat hazards are having the most adverse impacts? We as transportation agencies and planners measure a number of different criteria when it comes to transportation system efficiency. When it comes to extreme heat, is there data collection or reporting standards that can help local agencies target the areas that are most vulnerable? So there may not be data collection reporting standards, but is there something that you might recommend or point to another resource or a future area of study?
I have probably something that might help if they're looking for data collection, data on injuries or fatalities. I'm not sure that it is always related to transit, but the Injury and Violence Prevention Branch within the Department of Public Health, they have a California injury data online database. And they have all manner of injury data recorded there. And I think they do provide categorization by underlying cause. So transit, I think, would appear there, but I'm not sure how prominently it figures relative to maybe workplace injuries in general, because that data does tend to get pulled from the workers' compensation database, because the state actually has a formal way in which it could probably insure against those kinds of losses or setbacks. So that's the one thing that I think might help and is related to this.
Thanks very much.
But yeah, that's a very interesting question, because we also, from our how we measured both attributable premature mortality and morbidity, we weren't able to we looked at specific heat related illnesses, but not injuries outside of work. So we looked at workplace injuries. And in terms of the transportation, we looked more at delays and road damage, which might impact, result in injuries as well, but that was not measured. But that's actually a great question, and definitely an interesting research question to follow.
I mean, just to use it as a segue into talking about the plight of the transit user. I mean, I think first, if somebody collapses at the bus stop, they're not going to say that's because Metro is, time between buses, was too long, and that the headways were resulting in someone standing out there for 20 minutes. It's going to be somebody who's like, has some heat stroke, and so it wouldn't be Metro's issue. But I think what I've realized in being involved in a number of things around this issue, and with UCLA around kind of potential interventions in public space, is that transit users really have very little agency. Like, they have to stand in the place where the bus is going to stop, and if you go stand at the tree that's 25 feet away, you could miss the bus. And in most places, the place that we looked at with this most recent work with UCLA through Grand Challenges was Pacoima, and there's a number of places where, like, there's no bus shelter and there's no tree, and so you are basically forced to stand there in the sun, waiting for the bus. So your people are likely maybe somewhat disadvantaged already by virtue of being transit dependent, and then we're sort of asking them to be in these harsh environments. And it really kind of, I think, what brought me around to this question of how can we install shade. Shade is just getting you out of the direct sun. It's not necessarily really reducing the temperature. It just means you're not as exposed. But how can we implement simple shade structures, on sidewalks, either by bus stops or places where there aren't bus stops? But I'm not the first one to draw attention to the potential for there to be better transit facilities, throughout LA County that, would kind of serve this new purpose of being a extreme heat mitigation strategy versus just being sort of a convenience. Maybe they need to be perceived as sort of, a necessity for public safety, and that kind of shifts the dynamic.
It's very helpful to know. Let's see, looking back into the chat, under SB 49, this comment is from Edgar Becerra. Under SB 49, Caltrans was tasked to evaluate solar power in the highway right-of-way. This could include highways that run through cities, where streets that are owned by Caltrans. So that's definitely an interesting future area of study. From Whitney Berry, we're hearing concerns about impacts to students on playgrounds and outdoor spaces while at school and after school programs. From Enrique Huerta, maladaptation is an obstacle. We need to get cooling strategies right while working within a window that is quickly closing.
Yeah, I wonder if Enrique what is the window that's closing, Enrique?
Hey, Walker, good to see you, my man.
Yeah,
Hi,
same.
Enrique Huerta, Legislative Director here at Climate Resolve. As many of you know, we've emitted so much carbon dioxide that we've actually moved away from the Goldilocks era. The Holocene is long gone. We are now welcoming the Anthropocene, which is marked by really high temperatures that really humans have never seen before. And so we are now in an era that is uncharted, and yet most of our strategies have been um, focusing on the biophysical, on conservation and preservation, which is great. I recognize California is one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world, and we have to find a way to maintain that. But at the same time, just as extreme heat is affecting the human physiology, a lot of our plants and trees may also succumb to a similar fate. And so my question is, what strategies are we finding, what traditional strategies may not be working for us moving forward?
I mean, the traditional strategy is planting trees. I mean, perhaps, Enrique, it means looking at other tree species that are, from areas where it's hotter. I have no idea.
I agree. Yes, well said, Walker.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, where was I? Oh, I know where I was. Anyway, Central Valley, but there's a whole bunch of Palo Verdes planted. And my mom, who I was with, was like, what are these weird green trees? And I said, well, those are all over Phoenix and Tucson, and maybe they planted them because they're better adapted towards current or future heat. Maybe they just picked them because they looked cool, but it was an unusual tree to see in that part of the state. And so it piqued that question for me.
I would raise my thumb, but I don't have that function. So thank you for that answer.
Thank you, Enrique. One thing I wanted to share, SCAG actually has a resource on climate resilient urban greening practices, where we posted the link in the chat, where we look at the long-term longevity of native plants, including plants that may be coming from other areas in the world, but would perform okay in our changing climate. So that particular webpage provides a step-by-step guide on considering those factors, and then also putting together a tree palette of potential species that might work in your community. So wanted to advertise that. And I keep on seeing questions come into the chat. Thanks everybody for being so participatory. Let's see. Oh, Mike Thiele shared that CPDH has an interim guide to equity-centered local heat planning. Did you want to speak a little bit about that, Mike Thiele?
Sure. So actually, I haven't gone through that guide entirely myself, but it's and it's in the works in the sense that they intend to finalize all their recommendations, but it's very focused at in terms of, I mean, their audience is local health jurisdictions, and the department actually engages with local health jurisdictions, I think at least 1 to 2 times a month, in terms of holding different sorts of office hours, trying to offer resources that are tailored to their needs in terms of addressing their top priorities for their communities, or if it is data or research, whatever they might be looking for. And this interim guide was intended to sort of be a one-stop shop for looking for things they could implement, recommendations that have already been developed that could be disseminated. And so it contains, I think, just a variety of guidance and suggestions, and where something is backed by rule and law, that's also pointed out. But as far as schools and childcare facilities are concerned, these are really still, in terms of, these are still recommendations and advice rather than rules that these institutions have to follow. So we are not fully I think to some extent we're still limited by how much the law can help us here. We have to use common sense and persuasion, and certainly a feeling of community in terms of like, ultimately our health is our biggest wealth, and try to do things proactively. So yeah, it's just one piece probably that could help, not look for different resources all over the place, but go there first and see if something useful is available. And if it's not, actually, the department needs to know. So it is good feedback for us to know what we're overlooking in terms of trying to put together something like this. Thank you
for sharing the resource. Let's see, we have a comment from Lindsay Nolan. A bus stop by me has a LA County Department of Public Health ad that explains the difference between heat illness and heat stroke. Makes me very disappointed in our work as planners and public health professionals, because how helpful is an info sign when you are transit dependent and need to take the bus to get to urgent care and there's insufficient shading at the stop. I think this speaks to the importance of having that feedback loop between local government and the residents who are taking advantage of the transportation resources available.
I think one thing that and this was from a study that I found really interesting, is when it comes to heat education or warning, is folks tend to when talking about themselves, they don't really absorb they're like, oh, I'll be fine, or they're not gonna look at it internally, but messaging towards, you should look into, you should check on your neighbors, check on your community, check on in terms of this transit, toward outwards of how other people can protect others, if to see the signs in others. I think that definitely would kind of have my understanding from that study is that people want to help others, and it's easier for them to think outward than think of how they can help themselves during these events.
It makes a lot of sense. Makes me think of the thing that we hear all the time on airplanes, right? Put your mask on before you put the mask on your child or other people who need a little bit of help. Let's see. Kaylee Morikawa is sharing some initiatives. The FEMA Stanford Act declarations for extreme heat, operationalizing buses as moving cooling centers, going fare-free, the way transit agencies are mobilized for evacuations and then get reimbursed for service. I believe Valley Metro in Phoenix has done this in addition to hard infrastructure projects. And then again from Enrique Huerta, Climate Resolve sponsored an extreme heat bill focusing on local planning, AB 2684. Ryan mandates that cities and counties, upon their next update to any general plan element, address extreme heat vulnerability. By doing so, they align their general plans with the state hazard mitigation plan, increasing award eligibility from FEMA pre-hazard mitigation BRIC funding. Let's see. Thanks very much for sharing that, Enrique.
Well, let's just find what happened with the bill. It said sponsored. Enrique, did it get signed or not?
I didn't want to brag, but yeah, it got signed by the governor. It's now law.
Excellent. And this is a little bit what I was trying to talk about, is some of these definitions or whatever standards, would kind of be driven by where you could access funding to, to do implementation. So, it's an easy target, the status of the bus stops, because it's so deplorable, but it's often just that metal stick with a little sign. But my understanding is that the bus shelters aren't provided by Metro, they're provided through the company that does advertising on the bus shelters. And then I don't know what the deal is between whoever permits those structures, because they're usually in public rights of way, like city of whatever right of way, about the equitable distribution of the shelters. I can imagine if they were only going to put them in places where there was value in the advertising, they would go to the more affluent areas. And maybe that's the simple reason why there aren't as many shelters in less affluent areas. But hopefully there is some component of that agreement that, you know, looks at some kind of equity in the distribution of shelters. So either that's like a implementation mechanism that needs to be updated, or it's just, you know, it's not viable given the need for, you know, pretty rapid deployment of shade, some kind of shade, you know, around bus stops.
Thanks, Walker. A lot of things to consider. I'm going to share 2 more comments and then we'll close out because we're running a little short on time. Let's see. Kaylee is sharing further. There's a movement to get FEMA to start considering extreme heat as they currently don't. From Lindsay Nolan, investing in place has done a lot of research around this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for this lively panel. Thank you to our experts, Maithili, Rabab, and Walker. We're very enthused to be able to share their expertise with you all and identify future areas for work for SCAG to support local entities, including jurisdictions, for addressing extreme heat in their communities. Thank you also to our participants. We had a really lively discussion. It was wonderful to learn from you just as much as we learned from our speakers. And I hope you found this session useful. Hope you found this session useful. We'd like to invite you to take a brief 2-minute survey to help us support future Toolbox Tuesdays. A link will also pop up when the meeting ends, so if you don't have your phone handy, it'll be available for you. I'll go ahead and post that link into the chat. And then, of course, special thanks to our staff who helped put this together: Jennifer Martinez, Amanda McDaniel, Jasper Dwyer, Jeannie Ma, Anita Au, India Brookover, and Annalie Ekman. And thanks also to the additional staff who helped support us. So there's the link to the chat. Please do take the survey, and we look forward to engaging with you again at future Toolbox Tuesdays. Stay safe and healthy and have a great day.
Thank you.